when we were living in Peru, there was a time that Charla and Gabby had to come back to the States for a funeral, and I was going to stay behind in this particular case. And we'd never done that before, where she was traveling, her with a child, without me. And so we didn't really think anything about it. She gets to Lima. They flew from Cuzco to Lima, and then they were going to fly to the United States. And I get a phone call from Charla about the time she's supposed to be boarding. And I didn't think anything of it, and I answered. And Charla's very undramatic, right? She's not a dramatic person at all. And she is frantic, pretty dramatic, right? And I said, what is wrong? What's going on? And she said, they won't let me leave the country without you. And it turns out, and probably for pretty good reason, you can't just leave a country with a child without the permission of both parents. We didn't think about it. We just said, yeah, it's fine for her to go to the United States. But it turns out she needed a notarized letter from me for this thing to work. And she's standing there in immigrations, and they're not going to let her through, which means she's going to miss the funeral. She was stuck in that moment. Now, I got on the phone with the immigrations officer, and I laid it on really, really thick. I don't know how I pulled it off in Spanish, but I convinced this guy somehow. He must have been feeling really generous to let her through, even though their laws demanded that they needed a notarized letter from me. It was a blessing from God, a little bit of luck, a little bit of perhaps compassion on a crying baby in that moment. They could have been really, really stuck in that moment. And here's the deal, all of us have been in that situation before, maybe not in an airport, but especially in traffic. You've been in a situation where you're driving down the interstate and you don't realize that it's coming, and you end up stuck for hours. I remember 5 or 6 years ago, we were just making a 2-hour trip to Nashville and got stuck for 5 hours, and there was nowhere to go. There were no exits in sight. We couldn't cross the median. It was awful. And you're thinking about the people who are actually in the accident, and then you're feeling guilty because you're complaining because you're stuck. But we've all been stuck like this before. And there's something about traveling that creates these sorts of stuck situations. But we live in a culture and really in a time in which we eliminate most of the stress that comes with being stuck. I mean, now all I have to do is, if I'm going on a long trip, I'll pull open the Waze app, and I will watch hours in advance. I'll click on that little button that says reports ahead, and I'll watch, is there anything 5-6 hours ahead that I need to be thinking about now, so I can avoid, in most cases, getting stuck on the interstate and can be watching it for hours ahead of time. And if you're stuck in an airport or a doctor's office, man, you've got all of your entertainment at the tips of your fingers. Any movie you want to watch, you won't miss your ball games. You won't miss anything. We've eliminated most of the pain and stress that comes with being stuck, even when it happens. But let's be clear, and I think most of us know this, there will come a time in life where circumstances that are out of your control will lead you to being stuck. And in those circumstances, no scrolling through social media or entertainment you might find on your phone will relieve the stress and the pain of that circumstance. There will be times when the circumstances of life that hurt will make you stuck. Maybe it's just the simple words that come from a doctor that are a diagnosis for a little while, at least leave you stuck. You had plans, and all of a sudden those plans are put on hold because of a diagnosis. You're stuck. Maybe it's something that's unfair that happens to you. Maybe a boss, or your boss is a jerk or something like that, and you don't get to move forward, or you get stuck, or you get blamed for something that you didn't do, and you end up stuck in maybe a position that you would like to move on from, but you can't. You're stuck in that position. And I think it can happen in school, regardless of your level. You can get stuck in a class that you don't want to be in for a while. You may be stuck in a career field or a major that you don't feel like you can get out of, and you're there for a long time. And I think family situations can leave us feeling stuck as well. Maybe the diagnosis of a loved one doesn't just impact that person, but it leaves you feeling stuck. Or maybe the sinfulness of a family member has left you in a position where you're stuck and there's nothing you can do about it. And I think about those who care for elderly family members. They wouldn't have it any other way, but there's some times they just feel stuck. And when you get in those circumstances, when you're stuck and there's nothing you can do about it, how do you respond? Because there's no doubt people are watching. They're watching how you respond to this stuck situation, and you want to handle it in the best possible way, but it can be really difficult in those moments. Turn your Bibles to Acts chapter 25. We're back in the book of Acts. We've taken about a three-week break. Now, I know that some of you are spoiled because I've been doing these cute little mini sermons of 7 or 8 minutes. And even my family said, someone in my family said, maybe you should just cut it down to 15 minutes this week, just to make, yeah, right? So there's no little cute little 7-minute sermonettes this week. We're going all in. We're back in the book of Acts. And what we find in Acts chapter 25, the context is simply this. Paul is stuck, and there's nothing he can do about it. What leads us up to this context in Acts chapter 25 is that in chapter 24, he goes back to Jerusalem. The Jews attack him. They want to kill him. The Romans rescue him, and they take him into custody to protect him. But then the Romans have to try to figure out what to do with him, so they go through this series of trials. There's plots, there's drama, but you get to chapter 25, and Paul's just plain stuck. In fact, go back just a couple of verses into chapter 24. Look at verses 26 and 27. This is about Felix the governor was hoping to get some money. Here's what it says. At the same time, he, Felix, hoped that money would be given him by Paul, so he sent for him often and conversed with him. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. Let that sink in. This is Paul, the greatest missionary in the history of the world. He's spent many years of his life traveling all across the Mediterranean, and now he's stuck. And he's in jail, but he's got some free. If you read the previous verses, he's got some freedom, and he's able to go to the governor. I hope he gets like some good meals when he gets to go talk to the governor. His friends are allowed to come in and out, but he's 2 years. Can you imagine that from a guy like Paul's perspective? Just being stuck, and there's absolutely nothing he can do about it. But now there's a new sheriff in town, right? Festus is the new governor, and maybe there's hope that Paul will get some relief and that Paul will get out. But as you read these verses, it becomes very quickly, you can see it very quickly that there's a lot of things going against Paul. In fact, as you read these verses, you notice a couple of words that keep popping up. If you go back to, here's where Paul is. Paul's in Caesarea. That's where jail is. Jerusalem is down here at the bottom of the screen. And so Festus comes on board, and he says, I got to figure out what's going on here. And so he goes down to Jerusalem and says, all right, what do I need to do with this Paul guy? And they're like, hey, can he come to Jerusalem? We'd like to have his trial here. And the text actually says they're trying to kill him. Like they want to attack him and kill him. And so he goes back to Caesarea and says, we got to have a trial about this. But all through it, notice the kind of phrases that are found. Chapter 24, verse 27. And desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. You skip into chapter 25, same story with Paul, or with Festus and the Jews. And they urged him, Festus, asking as a favor against Paul that he might summon him to Jerusalem. You keep going. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, you know what's going on here, right? Politics. Paul can't get out of this stuck situation because things are political. There will be times in your life where you may get stuck in a place where you don't want to be because of politics. And by politics, I don't necessarily mean the government, though sometimes that might be the case. Have you ever heard it said before? Yeah, I can't get that job. Everything's political around here. You may get stuck in a situation because things are political. That's what happens to Paul here. But Festus says, let's bring everybody together. Let's have a little powwow and figure out what to do with Paul. And so Paul defends himself and tries to figure out what to do. And here's what happens. This is chapter 25. Look at verse 9 again. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I've done no wrong, as you yourselves know very well. If I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. So Paul says, I've done nothing wrong. I don't deserve I've done nothing wrong, but he's still stuck. Middle of verse, but if there's nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. Those are kind of big moments. He says, I want to go to Rome, because he knows when you see all these words, underline, favor, favor, favor. He's not getting a fair shake. And so he says, I've got to get out of here. I've got to get to Rome if I have any chance of getting anything fair happening for me. Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, here's famous big words, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. And it's like, wow, look what it's come to for Paul. But I think it's interesting here that not only is Paul stuck and there's nothing he can do about it, Paul's stuck and he didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes you will get stuck in life and it's not your fault. People may accuse you falsely and it'll hurt and it'll make you really angry and frustrated. But there are times in life you get stuck and it's not your own fault. Later, Festus will say about this whole situation, when the accuser stood up, he's retelling the story. He says, when the accuser stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I supposed. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion, about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. In other words, Paul didn't do anything. It's like a religious debate they're dealing with. I don't know what to do with Paul. This has nothing to do with me. And what's really cool about the book of Acts, over and over again, you know what Luke shows? Paul's done nothing wrong legally. Do you think that matters when he gets to Rome? And perhaps there's this document that shows all the times that Paul got taken into Roman custody, and over again, Roman authorities are like, we don't know what to do with him. This is just some religious debate, and it happens right here. He will later say, but I have found that he had done nothing deserving death. And as he appealed to the emperor, I decided to let him go. Do you remember, I don't know, a month and a half ago when we talked about the parallels between Paul's story and Jesus' story? Here it is one more time. Repeatedly, Festus, the Roman governor, says Paul didn't do anything wrong. Just like that Roman governor named Pilate repeatedly said about Jesus, he didn't do anything wrong. The parallels between Paul's trials and Jesus' trials are just amazing. 3 times Pilate says, I find no guilt in this man. I don't find him guilty. I've found in him no guilt deserving death. Listen, if you're ever stuck because someone's accused you of something that you didn't do, if you're stuck even though you didn't do anything wrong, you're following the example of some pretty good people before you, in both Jesus and Paul. The rest of this story is rather strange, and it leads into chapter 26, which is what we'll talk about next week. But basically, one of the Jewish rulers comes to town, just randomly visiting. His name's Agrippa. He's the grandson of Herod Agrippa the Great, Herod the Great, rather. And they don't know exactly what to do. Festus doesn't know what to do about him. So he tells Herod, getting this guy wrong so many times, he tells Agrippa, this guy who comes visit the king, he says, here's this Paul guy, and I don't really know what to do with him. And here's what Festus says. Look at this. This is chapter 25, verse 22. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, you will hear him. Except tomorrow you will not hear. Next Sunday you will hear what Paul has to say in response to this. All right? So you got this. Paul's just stuck. And it's these local authorities saying, hey, what are we going to do with Paul? Let's just have more powwows and talk about what to do with Paul. And again, next week we'll get to see what happens with Paul next. But what I want you to see very clearly in Acts chapter 25 is that Paul is stuck. And there's nothing he can do about it. Which leaves me asking a pretty serious question. What do we do when we get stuck and it feels like there's nothing we can do about it? Because here's the reality. We'll all at some point get there. What do you do when circumstances that are out of your control leave you stuck? What do you do when a health diagnosis leaves you stuck? What do you do when you're accused falsely or you've got a jerk for a boss and you're just stuck? What do you do when life leaves you stuck? Let me suggest a couple of things I think this story reminds us of. Number one, I'm reminded that when you're stuck or when you are trying to learn to respond to being stuck, acknowledge, first of all, that at some point you will be. Up front, acknowledge that at some point you will be stuck. We do that when we travel, don't we? Don't you build in that possibility of getting stuck? Especially if you're on a long road trip and you're on some family vacation. I have said to my family before, now guys, remember that not everything may go as smoothly as we want it to. We may get somewhere and things may not turn out. When we arrived to Arches National Park a year and a half ago or so, we knew that this was a possibility. These are the lines that show up at some of the national parks. Now, I do my homework and my research, so we had shown up at 6 o'clock in the morning so that we didn't have to deal with this. But we came out at about 9 o'clock in the morning to the visitor center, and there was no line. There were no cars. There was nothing, except all the cars were way on down the road. And I said, what's going on? And they said, well, at about 8:30, the park, this big national park, they decided it was full. And they closed the gates at 8:30 in the morning. About noon or so, we left to go for lunch because we're going to come back in the evening when it's not crowded. There were people sitting at the main sign way out there at the end of this road. They were sitting on rocks. They were out of their car, and you could just see the anger in their faces. They had driven across the country to see Arches National Park, and they showed up too late at 8:30 in the morning. And they were so frustrated. Listen, if you travel and don't do your homework, I'll add that, you're going to end up stuck sometimes, and you're not going to get to see the things that you sometimes want to see. We've got to acknowledge that about life. There will be times in life when you get stuck, and there's nothing you can do about it. And if you can go in ahead of time recognizing that, being willing to kind of roll with the punches, you're going to handle it better. And here's the deal. The reason you should acknowledge this now is so that you can handle it better when it does come, because people are watching the way we respond when we get stuck. Your family's watching. Your kids are watching. And you know that your kids will mirror the way that they'll respond in the same way to that stuck situation as you're responding to that stuck situation. Your coworkers watching, people at school, people in your life are watching to see how you respond to being stuck. So acknowledge at some point you will be. But I think we also learned from Paul here that to the best of our ability, we shouldn't give reasons for other people to bring us down. In other words, we should do our very best to be blameless. Paul had done nothing wrong, and yet he's stuck in this really tough situation. Now, here's what I know. All of us will get stuck at some point in our lives because we do something stupid. We could probably go around the room and talk about times that we messed up, we said the wrong thing, did the wrong thing in front of a boss, and we got into a little bit of trouble. And thank God for His grace when these moments come, when we mess up, and we will. But to the best of our ability, we ought to be trying to live like Paul did. Right here in this chapter, we've read the verses already. Paul says, if I've done anything wrong, this is verse 11, if I'm a wrongdoer and committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But there's nothing to their charges against me. Paul says, I haven't done anything. If I've done something, then I'll pay the consequence. But I haven't done anything. In the context of what it looks like to suffer as a Christian, Peter says this in 1 Peter 4. He says, if you're insulted for the name of Christ, you're blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. To the best of our ability, if we're going to suffer, let's make sure we suffer because we're doing what's right, not because we're being selfish or criminal in this case, or sinful, right? In chapter 2 of 1 Peter, here's what he says, for this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. It's going to happen. You're going to sometimes suffer and it won't be fair. For what credit is it if when you sin, you are beaten for it, you endure? In other words, so you've endured suffering because you deserved it. Peter says, so what? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you've been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. In other words, let's follow Jesus' example of doing the best to the best of our ability, living blameless lives so that nobody can say anything about us. Let's do our best to not give other people reasons to bring us down. Let's be blameless. But I suppose the biggest thing that I learned from the way Paul deals with this moment of being stuck is the fact that right in the middle of this story, the resurrection is brought up. Look right here in chapter 25, verse 19. Festus is describing the situation to King Agrippa, and he says this, rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Paul says, or Festus says, so this argument is a religious one, and it's about some guy who died, but Paul says he's alive. He's completely confused by the situation. But for Paul, the fact that he believed that there was a man named Jesus who died and is now alive, this was the reason he existed. This was the reason he did everything that he did. This was the reason that he could endure being stuck. Listen, I forgot this one. Oh, this is a good one. Seek justice, but don't always count on it. Isn't that what Paul does here? And Paul is trying his best to work through the Roman system of justice to get out of this. But it's not always going to work out because you got guys who are looking for favors, like Festus and Felix and others. I'm thankful to live in the United States where we have a great system of justice. I'm thankful we live in a culture in which most workplaces have a system of appeals when you feel like you've been mistreated. But all of the systems that we live and work under are run by fallible human beings. At best, fallible human beings. At worst, human beings who are sometimes selfish and greedy. In many cases, we'll get justice, but don't always count on it. But I'll come back now to the resurrection. For Paul, this was central to him, and here's what I'd say to you. If you're stuck right now, if you're stuck, your situation, my situation, is never the final word. Stuck is never the final word. Wait is never the final word. Unfair, if that's the cause of your situation, unfair is never the final word. No. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the final word. And that's why we can endure any situation that we find ourselves in, because we know that even when we're stuck, it's never final. Stuck may not be fun, but stuck is never final. And that's what gets Paul through here. He knows that Jesus rose from the dead, and that changes everything. In the book of Acts, did you know that the crucifixion and the cross is mentioned 6 times? 6 times. In the book of Acts, the resurrection is mentioned 26 times. Now, that doesn't take away from the centrality of the crucifixion, not at all, but it does show us that for the early Christians who were trying to make it through really difficult times, the resurrection of Jesus meant everything. And if you're in a stuck situation today, I hope you recognize that the resurrection of Jesus Christ means everything. It's the reason we can make it through, because here's why this is so important. When you're stuck, it seems like it's going to last forever, doesn't it? You look at the situation and you think, there's no end to this. And you can't, life experience tells you eventually that in many cases, though not every case, in many cases, eventually you'll get out of it. But when you're in the middle of it, man, stuck feels so final. And it feels as if we're never going to get out of it. We're never going to escape. We're never going to get justice. It's just always going to be this way. But the reality of the crucifixion reminds us that ultimately we will be freed. Ultimately, we will have justice. And ultimately, if you're covered by the blood of Jesus, you will stand innocent before the great God of the universe and then spend eternity with Him. That's what gets us through. You see, stuck isn't fun, but it's never final because of the resurrection of Jesus. I don't know where you're at today. I'm guessing that there's some folks here today that find themselves in a stuck place. And you're struggling through it. You're trying, but you're struggling. There's different levels of stuck. For some of you, it's fairly low level, and you don't feel that bothered about it, but you know you're stuck. But then there's some of you who are really in some tough spots. And if you're not in one of those tough spots right now, you know that at some point you will be. It happens to all of us. And my reminder to you from this story where Paul finds himself really, really stuck is that it's never final. Stuck is not the final word. One of my fears is that, this is a silly one, and it's not, I don't think about it often, is that I'll end up stuck like at the top of one of these things. I love a good roller coaster. In fact, we were at this particular park, Cedar Point, this summer, and we looked up at this roller coaster, and I promise, the day we were there, it got stuck right in that position. And I remember looking up there and thinking, I do not know what I do. Like, I love those roller coasters, but you just leave me hanging there on the precipice of death? I don't know. It just seems so terrible. Like, I do not want to be stuck right there. But it may be at some point in life you feel like you're stuck in a position like that and you're there for a long time. Here's the deal, even in this situation, it's not final. They'll eventually, it may seem like forever till they finally get things going or they come rescue you, but eventually you'll get out of this. I want you to know today, and I think Paul would remind us today, that your circumstances do not have the last word. Your critics do not have the last word. Your persecutors do not have the last word. Your boss will not have the last word. Guys, Satan will not have the last word. And death will not have the final word. Jesus walked out of a tomb alive. And that's why we're confident today. Stuck isn't fun, but it's never final. If there's anything we can do today to help you to come to know the resurrected Jesus, we'd love to do that while we stand and sing together.